During our Farm Basics time today, we're going to discuss probably the thing that frustrates farmers the most in terms of spending money. It's spending money on drying corn down.
Well, you know, we're standing in a particular cornfield of ours that yielded great this year, but it was a little wetter than we were hoping for this fall. And when you think about moisture in the corn, farmers need to get that moisture down to about 15% in the corn to be able to sell it at the elevator without getting docked or without getting part of the price discounted for excess moisture.
Well, the way I explain it to my little 7-year-old son is I just say, Zach, you know, in this kernel of corn, there's about 85% stuff and about 15% water. Okay, if it gets up to 20% water and only 80% stuff, it starts to go bad. It starts to rot and get mold and everything. And he's like, okay, Dad, I think I got that. And basically, what we're trying to say is, farmers have to have this corn dry to store it in grain bins, number one, but also to be able to sell it to a grain elevator, like Darren was saying, without a dock or a discounted price.
So how do you get corn to dry down? Farmers' preference would be to leave it out in the field and let the sun and the wind and hopefully warm afternoons dry that grain down naturally. Now, normally when you get later on into the fall, into November and into December, that corn dries down very little each day because there really isn't that much heat left, and you may see that corn move down slightly, but chances are the good drying days happened back in September and October.
So here's the thing, when a farmer is deciding what corn hybrids he's going to plant, he can plant what we would consider an early maturing corn hybrid or a later maturing corn hybrid for his particular area. So in other words, depending on the corn hybrid the farmer plants, it might reach maturity sooner rather than later. So if it reaches maturity sooner, obviously it's going to be drier in the fall. So knowing this, you might say, well, why wouldn't every farmer just try to pick early maturing hybrids for their area? But the problem is not all the early maturing hybrids will yield very well.
Well, when you think about it, if you've got a hybrid that takes a little bit longer to mature, if you get some favorable weather along the way or you get a late season rain, things like that, it has a chance to help that corn out even more. If your corn's already matured and it's done, and now it's just to the point of drying down and getting ready for harvest, and you happen to get some favorable late season weather, it just doesn't work out as well. So that corn isn't going to yield as well or produce as many kernels or as much kernel weight out in that field as a longer day hybrid. So you have to trade those things out. Yield versus getting it to finish out and mature in time to be able to harvest that year.
Okay, let's run through some specific numbers. Let's just say, for example, that a corn hybrid was at 22% moisture and we needed to get down to 15% moisture. So that is 7 points difference of moisture. Well, what we figure for drying cost is 42 cents total if you're going to dry it down 7 points, because we're going to go 6 cents per point. So 6 cents times 7 is 42 cents. Now, if you have 200 bushel corn, like in this field right here, it was 200 bushel corn. Okay, you take 200 bushels times 42 cents. That is $84 an acre. $84 an acre. And we had 1,700 acres of corn on our farm this year. So I can't even run that math, but I mean, you're going to spend upwards of $140,000, $150,000 if all your corn was that moisture. That is a tremendous amount of money.
Well, if you're the fuel guy, Brian, you have to be pretty happy because, wow, they're going to have to buy a lot of propane to try and dry all that corn down. And then you look at, okay, the cost of drying. There's a couple different ways you can dry down. What a lot of farmers will do is use something like propane or natural gas, fire up a dryer that blows heat through the bin, and using heat and forced air, they can force some of that moisture out of those kernels and dry it down relatively quickly. The other way to do it is to put the grain in bins with just air running. No heat, just air. And you run that for weeks and maybe even months to try and dry that grain down slowly. As far as the quality of that kernel of grain, air drying is great. However, the disadvantage with air drying is you can't put 25% moisture in a bin and hope to air dry it down in time because, as Brian so eloquently put it to his 7-year-old, it's going to spoil before then. So you have this fine line of, okay, I can air dry it if it's maybe 17% moisture and take off a couple of points. That's no big deal. But if it's a little bit wetter, I definitely have to use heat and forced air to get that grain to dry down.
So it is a challenge for farmers trying to get relatively dry corn in the spring. It depends a lot on the year. Last year we had a relatively warm year. actually a very warm year around the entire country, so most corn was done early in the fall, so it was fully dried by the time the farmer came along to combine it. Well, this year was the exact opposite. Nothing got ready early, so there's a lot of wet corn this fall. Farmers had to spend a tremendous amount of money just to dry that corn down. Otherwise, they had to leave it in the field real late in the season, and the longer a farmer leaves the crop in the field, the more chance animals have to get it, or weather could come along, like we had a big windstorm that knocked down some corn late in October this year. You know, all these problems come about if you can't harvest until later on in the season. So drying the corn down is a huge issue on farms across the country, and unfortunately, so is our weight of the week. It's a problem just about everywhere. We'll tell you how to control it though on your farm coming up later in the show.